Hello everyone, I'm Lucas Kitchen. Welcome to More to the Story. This episode is based on an article I wrote for Free Grace International. You can get to that article by going to freegrace.in/flood. And as you can guess from the title, it is about the flood, but from a different angle. So, why can't the world forget the flood? And also, what in the world does that title mean? Well, let's explore it. So I was recently doing some research on ancient history and religion, which I know sounds super nerdy, and that's because it is. It's very nerdy, but it's something I'm interested in, obviously. And so as I was perusing the internet and talking to my AI assistants, I usually have 3 of them open at any time, and I was asking them about various things that they were aware of in ancient history, I came across the Sumerian kings list. You ever heard of the Sumerian kings list? Well, it caught my attention for a really particular reason, but I'll get to that in a second. First, let me tell you a little bit about what it is. So, from the Sumerians, we have, really the instances of the earliest recorded history. Now, there's like relics and stuff from other cultures that might predate that, but from the earliest, written stuff, it's going to come from the Sumerians. And from what we have, the earliest is like 3500 BC. Think about that. That is a long time ago. So the Sumerian king list is not from quite that old, but it is from about 2100 BC. Okay, so the Sumerian kings list is an ancient manuscript that records names and the reigns of these kings and the cities where they reigned. And it is a long list. I read through the whole thing. Again, super nerdy, but I wanted to read the whole thing, and it took a long time. So it's believed to be around 2000 BC, 2100 BC, something like that. So here's what I found fascinating about this ancient manuscript, which, by the way, I read it in English. I don't read ancient cuneiform or whatever it's in. I just read a translation that was done by, it was a great name. The translator was Thorkild Jacobsen, 1930s. So here's what I found fascinating about this king's list. First, it says that the kingship descended from heaven. Okay, that's the wording it uses, descended from heaven. So this alone wouldn't really be all that surprising, since many ancient cultures claimed divine rights for their kings and their royalty and their leaders. But what I read next really did surprise me. So in the Sumerian king list, history is divided into 2 sections of history, I guess you could say. The first section contains kings whose reigns lasted tens of thousands of years. Okay, so it says that there's these kings, and every single one of them is tens of thousands of years. Some like 200,000. I remember seeing one that was like 200,000 years is the reign of this king. And a couple of them, and also the numbers are repetitive, which would be really uncanny. So it's kind of like maybe those numbers mean something symbolic. I don't know. As I'm reading, it's like, wow, what a bunch of liars. That's weird. But then, and in that, I was thinking like, well, that's not real uncommon for ancient history to kind of dip into mythology and to be very exaggerated, right? It's just kind of the way that things are. I remember somewhere in Egyptian history how the Egyptian army always won, so to speak, but sometimes after they won, they had to fight the next battle like 30 miles into their own territory, which means what really happened is they lost, and the historian didn't want to lose his head, so he said they won, that kind of stuff. So that kind of stuff, that kind of loose playment happens in history, and we know that. So I was thinking, well, maybe that's what this is. These incredibly long periods of kings reigning. However, what I spotted next, it's kind of like it clobbered me, like one of those Russian slap fight champions. You ever seen those guys? It's crazy. But what I saw next really did hit me pretty hard. I'm going to give you a direct quote from the translation by Thurkild Jacobson from the 1930s. Here's how he translates this line. It says, after the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. And then it goes on. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. What did I just read? Went back and looked, and sure enough, the flood had swept over. So it speaks, and it's almost just matter of fact. There's no, in the whole thing, there is, I want to say, no other historical events other than kings being deposed and reigning from various places. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure there was nothing else except for this flood. So this flood was a dividing point in history, in their ancient history. And so it speaks of this flood that swept over the land. So that started to feel familiar. I'm like, okay, people before the flood living a really long time, and then, flood sweeps over the land. So I kept reading, wondering what I'd find. And as it listed king after king, after the flood, post-flood, I noticed a gradual change in the number of years that each king reigned. So after the flood, in this document, the length of time that the kings reigned gradually reduced down to what would be kind of normal amounts of time. Now, still, some of them very long, still some of them tens of thousands of years, but it reduced down to something that was more reasonable to human experience. And there's lots of theories that historians have on why that happened. But what stood out to me was basically this, that one of the world's most ancient written records, apart from the Bible, of course, claims that heaven gave man authority to rule, and that there was a flood, and that pre-flood lifespans were incredibly long, and that a flood swept over the land, and then afterward, the lifespans gradually reduced after that flood. So I was pretty amazed by this. Like, I actually, in fact, I think I was talking to my AI assistant when I spotted this, and I kind of went back to it and said, now, hold up, am I understanding this right? That, this document, and, other people have, I'm not the first to discover this. Obviously, this is a known document. It just was new to me. I had probably heard about it at some point, but just kind of breezed over it, but I'd never gone and read it, So I was pretty amazed by this. So while the specific details, in the Sumerian kings list are very different from what's in the Bible, it's not focused on the same thing that the Bible is trying to do, right? I mean, it's very different. And by the way, Sumeria is up. I'm sorry, not Samaria. Was I saying Samaria? I didn't mean that. I meant Sumer. Sumer was up in the area of Ur, and I'm not real clear on the relationship here, but like the Chaldeans and Ur of that region, this is kind of in that area. So it's kind of the area where Abraham actually came from. So that's an interesting, carryover there too. So, the details in this document from Sumer, they're so different from what we have in the Bible, except for these few little details that hint at something shared, something that, is a universal experience, So what does it mean? I mean, what do we do with this? Well, there's basically two explanations that I can think of for why these similarities exist. And I'm going to go first with what an atheist probably would say. Okay, so just hypothetically here, the atheist would likely say that the Bible stories are myths and that they're copied from a previous myth in the Sumerian, the records of Sumer, right? That would be the atheist viewpoint. Or maybe vice versa, that one's copied from another, but they're not actually shared, they don't actually come from a shared, unified, cataclysm story. But while that sounds like a compelling theory, it kind of breaks apart when you begin to realize that the phenomenon of flood and flood stories in ancient culture is not unique to Sumer, right? I mean, it is something that we see throughout the world, something that we see in virtually every culture in the world, at least one portion of them. You can find a flood story. Now, that's not to say that every single tribe that's ever been discovered is talking about the flood, but generally in pretty much any part of the world, you can find a flood story available in that cultural heritage. And I want to give you some examples. In the Mesopotamian cultures, there's the Epic of Gilgamesh. And look, I'm not an expert at pronouncing really bizarre names from ancient cultures, so, forgive me here if I mispronounce these. But Utanapishtim survives a great flood sent by the gods, and he survives it by building a boat. Does that sound familiar? Another one in Greek mythology, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a great flood sent by Zeus by building an ark. And Norse mythology, now the Norse mythology version seems to be a bit different than a lot of the others. It is very wrapped up apparently in the creation story too, which is very mythological. Okay, but Norse mythology, Bergelmir and his wife survive a flood sent by the gods by building a boat. In Nigeria, this one I'd never heard of. A lot of these I've never heard of, but this one was really unique to me. In Nigeria, the Olkun floods the world. And I think this is a sub-people group in Nigeria, the Yoruba, who have this tradition that the Olukun floods the world, but Orunmila saves humanity by calming the waters. Okay, so that one's a little bit different. Hindu mythology, Manu, warned by the god Vishnu, builds a boat to survive a great flood. That one feels pretty on the nose. Chinese mythology, Yu the Great controls the great flood. Stories found in Classic of Mountains and Seas and Records of the Grand Historian. So here's the thing about those six. Is that six? Yeah, that's six. Here's the thing about those six. You know, that atheist perspective that, these are just shared stories that got passed around. You could almost make that argument among these because each of these have kind of a shared landmass where peoples could move from place to place. Now, it's kind of unlikely that they could, they didn't easily move, people weren't really all that nomadic as ancient as some of these stories are, but people could technically go from place to place and share stories among these. But the next, let's see how many, the next four, it looks like, it'd be hard to claim that. So check this out. All of the previous five shared at least some geographical connection through the continental landmass. Okay, so that's Africa, China, India, and then in Europe and Mesopotamia. But these don't share a landmass, and yet we still see this flood story. So the Native American cultures, this is interesting, when the Cree, a great flood survived by a few humans and animals in a giant canoe. Holy cow. That's the flood story. A great flood survived by a few humans and animals in a giant canoe. This is in the American continent, okay? And this is a traditional story among the Cree. The Hopi people also had a flood story. Flood sent by the gods, from which a few people escaped by climbing a tall reed. That one's a little different. I don't know, climbing a tall reed. But remember that some of the earliest boats in history that we know about were reed boats. So you could still see kind of a connection. They climbed upon, maybe in that tradition, it warped into a reed boat, and then it warped into climbing onto a tall reed. I don't know. But there's some overlap there. There are Aboriginal groups in Australia. Here's one, the Gundit Jumara. It's hard to say. The ancestral being Titlek released waters and caused a great flood. Polynesia. This is an interesting one because these groups were very isolated for a very long time. Polynesian groups, like the Hawaiian myth of Nu'u, survives a great flood by building an ark. Okay, so and there's others, but these are some great examples. And these last four that I just told you about, these are ones that are separated by. I mean, they're isolated from the land mass that we have in the Europes and in Europe and Mesopotamia and Africa and China that we talked about earlier. So if a story is borrowed or shared, it had to be extremely early. It had to be extremely early before these people groups divided. And so it brings into question so much. But one thing it points to for me is that there is a shared flood narrative in cultures all over the world. And there's some interesting consistencies in those flood stories, and I want to talk about that as we go on. So it's amazing that the story of a great flood, and these aren't regional floods, right? I mean, these are the great flood, appears throughout the world, even in cultures that have been divided. I kind of just talked about that. I'm doing a mix here of reading the article and kind of giving commentary on it. So it's really hard to imagine. I mean, this is where the atheist theory of borrowing mythologies just kind of breaks to pieces, right? Because how would, for instance, Native Americans borrow mythology from ancient Sumer? I don't even know. That doesn't even make sense. And when did the Australian Aboriginals borrow from the Greeks? This is super ancient stuff. And these cultures, as far as anthropologists say, they've been there for so long. Why is there, this shared concept? So in my mind, Occam's razor is the sharpest option in this case, and just meaning what's the simplest answer. It seems much more reasonable to me that a flood happened early in human history, that there was a cataclysmic flood that happened early in human history, and it's being remembered down through the generations. It was such a cataclysmic flood that cultures just couldn't forget it. That it was a talking point for however many generations followed, and it continued to be. So here's a couple of interesting things about these flood stories that I kind of dug up, and I'm going to tell you the truth. I have read bits of some of them, but I have not been able to track down all of them. It'd be a great research project to kind of compare and contrast. But this is kind of high-level stuff, basically getting commentary on these and comparing the commentary about them. So in almost all of the non-biblical flood stories, okay, so these are those cultural stories, the flood is remembered as judgment for the evils of humanity. And it's stated different ways and, different, some more implication, some just straight out say that. But that's an interesting point, that the flood is judgment. And the judgment, kind of number two here, the judgment is poured out by the highest divine power each culture recognizes in its religious system. So if you're a Greek, then your highest god would be Zeus, right? And so, the flood comes from Zeus. If you're a Hindu, I suppose their highest deity was Vishnu, So that's a consistent thing, that it came from on high, basically. And then in the vast majority of these stories, the vast majority of humanity dies in the flood. Okay, so it's a judgment, and the vast majority of humanity dies in the flood. And in most of these, there's a couple that this isn't true. This one isn't true, but in most of these stories, there are instructions that precede the flood. And those instructions are to take action, generally build a boat. Some are a little different, in the actual details, but basically it's do a certain thing to prepare for this flood. And they're supposed to do that. And if they do that, they survive. And it's a small number of people that survive, right? So So in that case, it is similar. They're very similar. I'll say they have similarities to the biblical narrative. Now, they are very different in a lot of aspects, but it's enough to say, man, I mean, these have got to be coming from a unified source. So clearly, not all the details are identical in every flood story, but they are similar enough to teach. Really, I guess I would say a very simple set of concepts throughout the world. It's a basic set of things, and it's really fundamental to the human experience that these lessons be taught, and it's some of the lessons that are present in all cultures. There is a higher power. Number one, there is a higher power that stands above the world. That is one of the lessons of the flood stories that we see throughout the culture, throughout cultures, and that this higher power judges human behavior. That's kind of number two. And there are consequences for evil, basically, and that evil leads to judgment, and that obedience leads to survival. So those are kind of the basic. It's kind of the basic structure that you see in these flood stories. And that is also a very basic set of, I don't know, what we would call them, like cosmological rules that make up that make up a lot of the spiritual underpinning for cultures throughout the world. So it kind of led me to wonder, is it possible that these flood stories are part of the moral foundation for, every culture in the world? It's kind of like an imprinted memory, right? It's like an imprinted memory to keep human behavior within certain parameters, one that, despite time, cannot be forgotten, that it persists. And I wonder, in cultures that get very, they go off the reservation, so to speak. They, their morality becomes more corrupt. I wonder in those cultures if they're more likely to remember the flood story because of its implications. So I don't know. That's a Lucas theory, but it's kind of an interesting one to me. So for those with a Christian perspective like me, that's where I'm coming from. Christian perspective. You can see why our enemy, the devil, would want the world to forget the flood. The flood is a lesson that shows God will not allow human behavior to become too corrupt beyond a certain point, right? And that there will be judgment for corruption, for evil, for sin. If you come from the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's called sin. So that is a pretty basic lesson that you see in these cultures, who have this flood story. But the memory of the worldwide flood has an even more powerful use than that, I think. So that might be like the foundation of some moral underpinnings. But what's even more interesting to me is how the flood stories in these various cultures have been used to be kind of a foundation for gospel missions. And so missionaries have identified these stories throughout cultures as they've spread out throughout the world, especially in the kind of the missionary movement of the 18 and 1900s. So missionaries have been able to use these, what we would call maybe like long-remembered cultural traditions, like the flood story, to build upon when they're sharing the gospel. And I pulled together a few examples. Now, some of these come from a book I really liked called Eternity in Their Hearts by Don Richardson. He's kind of a leading thinker in missions. His books are a few years old now, but they're fascinating. They're amazing. But he mentioned some of these, and then these are gathered from some other places. But here's some examples of missionaries that have used the flood story kind of to build upon, going back and finding that common ground, so to speak, or that common flood, I guess is probably better, and then building on that and coming up to the point of Jesus. Isabella Kahn, Fraser McCluskey, William Marcus Young, each of these, now they each ministered in different places, but each of them discovered flood stories. Let's see, one was in China. I think two of them were in Burma, but in different places. And each of them found that the people they were ministering to had both great flood stories, old ancient stories of the flood, but also a couple of these cultures had like a traditional prophecy that a white brother, I'm putting that in air quotes there, a white brother would come with a book of truth. I mean, man, and this is not just in Don Richardson's book. This is attested by a few different sources. And so these missionaries could use that shared flood story to build on that and then build up the narrative, almost as if, you come to this culture and you're like, you guys have the history of the early world up to the flood. I want to take it from there and help you understand what happened after that, And so these missionaries had were able to use this flood story to great effect among these people. Other examples, or like among the Hopi people and various peoples in India and Polynesian groups. I mean, because those flood stories exist in different cultures, they can be used, as long as the people recognize and remember them and talk about them, then they can be used in evangelistic efforts. So it's kind of like this. I think of it like these stories are like little time capsules that have been laid in the dirt of deep memory in these cultures. And they're only to be opened when the gospel finally arrives. I mean, they're just kind of bouncing around there in the traditional, oral tradition and the cultural memory of a tribe or a people group. But then when the gospel comes, they can be used. They can be opened up and they can be looked at and like, wow, what do we do with this and how do we build on this, And so down through the ages, the evil in our world, the devil and the enemy, has not been able to scrub the memory of God's greatest temporal judgment poured out on the earth. I'm sure that Satan would love for people all over to forget the flood, because the flood teaches us so much about what God expects and how he will respond to our evil inclinations. And so I'm sure Satan would love for it to be forgotten, but God didn't allow it. God didn't allow it to be forgotten. So what an amazing epic, right? That persists even until it's used to introduce people to God's love, to the Son he gave for their salvation. One more thought on why the world hasn't forgotten the flood story. So if you're a naturalist, if you don't believe in the supernatural and you just think things are just, I said naturalist, I probably should have said a materialist. Sorry. If you're a materialist and you just think that things are what they are and there's no supernatural, then it is hard to answer why would these flood stories be all over the world and persist. And I have this supernatural idea that maybe, just maybe, God is responsible for not letting it be forgotten. That it's remembered on purpose. And if you read what God says in Genesis 9:12 through 16, it talks a lot about remembering. It talks a lot about how important it is to remember. So let me read that for you. So this is right after the flood, right? This is right after Noah pops off the hatch door of the ark, and comes out, and God starts making this covenant with him, and not just with Noah, but with the rest of humankind. And so this is a covenant with you and me. This is a covenant God made with us, and we don't have to do anything for him to keep his side of it. But I want you to notice how much it talks about remembering. It says, "And God said, 'This is the sign of the covenant I am making between you and me and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will," here's the word, "remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Wherever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. Genesis 9:12 through 16. You notice how much he talks about that he's going to remember this covenant. He's going to remember what happened. He's going to keep it in his mind. Now, he's omniscient, right? And so what does it mean for him to remember? Well, I don't really know. But remember is a word that is meaningful to us because down through the generations, people still remember the flood. People that are isolated and separated, people that are in the back end of the tropical jungle so far from anything, and yet they have a memory of what God did in the flood. It's amazing. Is it possible that the world can't forget the flood because God promised to always remember? Is it possible that cultural memories of the flood might actually be a faint echo of God's influence on the memories of those who live in his protected world? And isn't it a protected world when you think about it? I mean, he could bring judgment today, but he has waited, and he's waited because he wants people to come to him. He doesn't want to end this thing in cataclysmic, fire or whatever. I'm sure what he wants is what he says he wants, which is for all people to come to the knowledge of him. He wants all people to be saved. And so God allows people, I believe, this is my Christian perspective here, but I believe God has allowed people down through the generations to remember fragments of stories about what he did so that when the message finally comes to their descendants, to their lineage, to their people, they would have some cultural foundation on which they can find some common ground and accept the truths of the gospel. So that's my take on that, and I might write some more about it. It's an interesting subject to me. One of the things I'm interested in writing in the future, and let me know if you want to hear about this, if you'd like me to write on this, is these references to the white brother who would bring a book of truth. That one stands out to me. Like those are modern prophecies if I've ever heard one. It's ones, and so I want to track those down. Don Richardson talks about them a little bit in his book Eternity in Their Hearts. That was published in 1981 by Regal Books. I highly suggest it, by the way. Fantastic book. He talks about it, but it's also attested to in some other works that I have not read, but I'd like to. The Karen Apostle or Memories of Ko-Thubayu, the first Karen convert. That's a book from 1843 by Francis Mason. He talks about some of this. Isabel Kuhn, which we talked about in the podcast, Ascent to the Tribes is that book. She was pioneering in North Thailand. And then the other I mentioned, if you want to go and look him up, is William Marcus Young. He was in the early 1900s, and so those talk about those aspects of kind of that prophecy, but also using flood narratives and other cultural analogies that they could use to kind of bring people into the faith. Well, that's my long, rambling thoughts for today. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you'd like to read the article to kind of let some of this sink in, you can go to freegrace.in/flood. If you'd like to share this, I'd be thrilled if you'd share it. Please do share it. You can find us on YouTube under my name, Lucas Kitchen, or under our ministry name, Free Grace International. I'm also on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I'm on TikTok. I'm on Twitter, which is X. I'm even on LinkedIn, and I don't have any friends on LinkedIn that I'm aware of. Maybe I have a few, but I don't do much on LinkedIn. If you're on LinkedIn, come send me a message. Let's see what's going on over there. Anyway, thanks for listening, you guys. We'll see you later.